the idea here is to celebrate, 10 years of this project. Significant body of work, tremendous amount of educational value for students applying the classroom learning to the real world. As you know, because most of you have been through this, this is a practicum, but this is in practice, right? This is the real world. This is applying what you know in situations where your client has a lot riding on what you find. David Scharia, who runs CTED, he's right over here. I'll introduce him again later, but yes, you can employ now. David's going to sort of run through his experience with this. And you're going to run through your experience with this project over 10 years and what you've gained and what you see ahead for us. And we'll listen very carefully because we're always interested in getting a little bit of an early warning on what might be happening, even though we've never actually had that, but maybe we will. Projects, beginning with the first one. Use of international communications technology by terrorists and potential UN responses. Counter messaging of extremist propaganda on social media. Design of an advisory group to assist CTED. That was a research project plus a roundtable at the end of that project. Forms of counterterrorism messaging. Some of these issues are sort of being revisited as they rise in importance. Improved intelligence sharing, if I can express it that way, David. That was a project that was interesting in some very sensitive ways. As any of you who participated, you're smiling. I saw. Was that your project?
No.
Okay, you just heard about it. Emerging trends in terrorism and counterterrorism, and particularly the role of something called the Global Research Network, which is a group of 130 or so institutions around the world that CTED established to advise them of emerging trends and sources of information and so forth. We CGA are members of that organization and use it quite, I think, effectively. Treatment of children returning from terrorist impacted areas, improving CTED engagement with the private sector, particularly the private technology sector. That was also a research project plus a workshop. Let's see, what is this? Establishing a process for CTED technical partnerships with the private sector. That was a kind of a focus group to test different ways of engaging the private sector, trying to elicit ideas from the private sector itself. Quantitative indicators of emerging trends in violent extremism. Then an emerging trends survey of the Global Research Network. Designing an information switchboard for CTED. Again, using GRN as a source of information and contacts. A GRN survey to document CTED accomplishments as well as gaps in the CTED mandate. That was to acknowledge the 20th anniversary of 9/11 and the formation of the Counterterrorism Committee of the Security Council. Alternative scenarios for the future of Afghanistan and the kinds of terrorism landscapes that each of those scenarios involved and the kinds of threats that might arise in those different scenarios, both within Afghanistan and in the region. That had two phases. Phase one was a kind of conceptual design of the scenarios. Phase two was a fleshing out of the scenarios and engagement with global experts on Afghanistan through a kind of a workshop. Sally Saad in a moment is going to stand up and tell you about that project in somewhat more detail. Terrorist use of drones, and Amalia will fill you in on that project. And then the current project, which is how member states of the UN are dealing with repatriation of terrorist fighters and their families from areas of conflict. That will be done, or that will be shared by 4 students you see in the corner over here. So it's a lot of work. It spans issues of importance and controversy. It's forward-looking in the sense that when we begin a project, David sits down with the rest of the group and his group, and we define a project. And they are almost invariably projects that sort of try to look around the corner and imagine the kind of challenges that CTED will be facing in the future. So again, thanks everyone for coming. Let's start with Saad and a briefing on Afghanistan scenarios. So what do you need?
Nothing.
Okay.
I have some notes. Hi, everyone. So I see a lot of familiar faces for the most part, and it's great to actually finally meet the CTED team in person. Unfortunately, we're mostly online, and so we didn't have the opportunity to either go to CTED or have the opportunity to meet you in person. But my name is Saad Bunjua. I'm a last semester student. I'm graduating in 2 weeks, so I can see the finish line. I had the opportunity to be part of the Practicum a year ago, and essentially, I think we presented that April 5th. And as Professor Oppenheimer indicated, our project was focused on the developing scenarios for Afghanistan. It was sort of phase 2 of the project that had started the prior semester, where the team had designed sort of concepts around scenarios, but also the drivers supporting the scenarios. Our responsibility was to sort of flesh that out and go into more detail and essentially developing narratives, fully developed narratives about where we saw Afghanistan go, essentially carry us out. An interesting caveat or clarification for those who are not very familiar with scenarios. Scenarios are not predictions. So we're not essentially trying to read the future, but rather developing a storyline that had to be plausible. And because we had 3 scenarios, they had to be distinctive. So we couldn't sort of create confusion about sort of what makes that scenario separate from the other one. So in terms of the work that we did, we essentially looked at what the team had done the prior semester and looked at their drivers. The drivers are actually supporting each scenario based on the most current information. If you remember, that first team started their work about a month after the US and their coalition partners left Afghanistan. We sort of came in 6 months later. So a lot of activities had occurred in between. So we had the opportunity to obviously leverage that information and essentially develop, flush out the drivers, update them, challenge ourselves and others to think about what those drivers should be, and then started thinking about the scenarios, again, sort of focusing on the plausibility and the distinctiveness of each scenario. And that was a little bit of a challenge. I think we had a lot of back and forth. We didn't do that alone. We had a lot of help, not only from CTED, but also, as Professor Oppenheimer indicated, we had the opportunity to actually get a lot of experts. We had a workshop that was very well attended, and we had experts from very different backgrounds, academia, researchers. We had somebody actually that called us from Kabul, I believe. And so that gave us the opportunity to essentially update our information and give it back to CTED for their feedback and obviously sign off. So in terms of deliverables, so just to high level, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but essentially talking about the drivers, we looked at 3 groups of drivers that we believed would inform sort of the scenario. So the first group was what we called internal drivers. So things that have to do with everything that's happening within Afghanistan, the economy, the political dynamics between the various factions of the Taliban, for example. The second group of drivers was actually, we called it regional, global. Think about where Afghanistan is, surrounded by a lot of countries that have a point of view about Afghanistan, including Pakistan, the Central Asian states. And so we captured that into one category. And then last but not least, and probably the most relevant to CTED, the third category was terrorist actors. So obviously, if you look at the situation in Afghanistan, but also looking at that situation sort of forward-looking, we certainly believe that terrorist actors would have a very important role to play in Afghanistan, depending on where sort of the situation, on how the situation could evolve. So with those drivers in mind, we came up with 3 different scenarios. The first one we called sort of Taliban consolidation. I would say sort of that was probably the most optimistic scenario, or we can, I think interestingly, 1 year, now we have a real review mirror, so we can probably reflect on that. But first scenario, consolidation in power, what we saw essentially the Taliban slowly but surely establishing itself as the leading political force in Afghanistan and becoming sort of the legitimate representative, not only internally, but also in the international community. Again, best case scenario. The second scenario was called balkanization. So the word is self-descriptive, but the idea here was for us to create a scenario where we'd see Afghanistan sort of becoming a little bit more fragmented with regional players controlling parts of the country, while the Taliban sort of remain control of Kabul. Again, very high level. I'm happy to answer questions. And the third, but last but not least, unfortunately, the most specific pessimistic scenario was focused on essentially Afghanistan as a failed state, where we saw sort of the economy collapse, the political situation collapse, sort of leading to essentially a failed state status, creating a void where the terrorist actors would step in and basically creating a chaos to the point where the US, again, this is a scenario, it's a storyline, would be forced to come back to Afghanistan 10 years out. So that was sort of the bulk of the deliverables. We also provided a perspective on the terrorism landscape, resulting from the scenarios, which we obviously are shared with CTED with recommendations. And what I forgot to mention, we also had a separate work stream, which is very unrelated, that I think, David, you had asked us to look at how to capture information on the ground outside of the official channels. So we had to do a little bit of data analysis, but also look at social media and essentially engage with a number of players on the ground to figure out how that information could be sort of channeled to CTED. That's in summary the project. I thought it was, just from a personal experience, I thought it was a great opportunity. So I came into the project with quite a bit of experience, but still felt that the project really helped enhance project management skills, presentation skills, obviously gaining that exposure to the UN and the counterterrorism office certainly was very insightful. Learning about terrorism, and certainly my group, my team of 2, had the responsibility to flesh out the terrorist actor driver category. So clearly gained a lot of insight into the space, and just walk away with certainly the most level of support or encouragement for anybody who's interested. I mean, I know you have some people interested. I think it's a really great experience.
And so those were kind of our 6 futures, and I would say our takeaways from that, ultimately going back to the typology, is that typology matters. We definitely had a lot to do in terms of understanding both drones and terrorist networks and groups and tendencies. And so in the future, it definitely could be useful to kind of recognize the nuance of the different strategies, the different aims of terrorist groups, but also, for instance, the different platforms in which drones can be acquired, those types of typologies, and also, for instance, the implications of a geographical, I guess, like nuance in terms of the fact that threats manifest much differently in much different areas, and that drones will likely be used much differently in much different areas by much different groups. And ultimately also recognizing and coming back to the point that drones are dual use technologies that are very easy to acquire and that are very easy to go undetected. That was a really big kind of question or problem for us in trying to create a solution to this, because, for instance, a counter drone technology, that's not really something that would be our first suggestion to states in combating this threat, due to the evolving nature of it, and due to the fact that there are still regulations that are being put in place just in general for civilian drone use and the presence of drones in the air. And that also, going back to that democratization of technology, that was a really important takeaway, I would say, from my perspective of the workshop, just in terms of really understanding the ease at which terrorists are able to acquire a weapon that is not necessarily intended to produce lethal effects, but certainly can, and it has already. And so those were really our biggest takeaways, and we had provided those recommendations, and we had done so in a way to just kind of embrace the emerging technology aspect of it, understand that things will change, not putting absolutes on our hypotheses or our futures. But we definitely, I think, aim to provide an overall view of the drone market, the way that drones are being used by terrorists. And I think we did a pretty good job in doing so. I was also then asked to talk about kind of the personal value of this. And I say this with my thesis advisor in the room. And then, but this has really inspired, honestly, my future research. I set forth on understanding how lethal autonomous weapon systems are being trained now, and how just kind of those connotations can have really grave implications on international security, and how the whole emerging technology nature of these things makes it really hard to make policy to address them, for several reasons. This was also my second practicum in undergrad. I had done one with the Department of Defense, where the deliverable was a more technical deliverable. But in the case of this one, it was a really exciting opportunity for me as I came to New York to be able to engage with institutions like the UN. And it provided a really good access point, not only into the UN, but also into like a professional experience. And I would say that's a really just like holistic value gain for me. Being able to work with people from all around the world, both within this program and within the practicum, was really important. And it really diversified, I would say, just our own viewpoints and even performing research. And on also like a nerdy and personal note, it was very cool to be able to have academics in the room that we were citing in our research and that we had actually been able to speak to in person. The peer review definitely felt a little bit harsh at times, but at the end really produced a really great image of the question that we were asked to solve. And I think that it added a lot of value to the hypotheses that we had produced. So we had a really great time.
From what I recall, back in 2017, the project scope was around countering violent extremism, and to look for pathways to promote youth prevention, particularly under the scope of CVE.
Yeah.
And so it was a lot of research into counter messaging, along the same lines of what I think the last briefing kind of covered in terms of using social media to de-radicalize and demobilize the same way that it's currently used to radicalize and mobilize. And I think the final project encompassed creating summary reports that actually fed into a UN Security Council resolution back in 2017, if I recall. Yeah. So it was a good culmination of a series of efforts.
Osama, you guys know Osama. Everybody here knows you. David, you want to reflect on the last 10 years and how much fun it's been?
I have notes here. I'm not sure I'm going to use them, but I'll carry them with me. I was very glad to hear that students who participated in the program felt they benefited from it in many ways. Actually, I would say even more that sometimes on LinkedIn, I see previous or alumni of the program still using this experience with CTED as a line in their CV, which for us is good to learn and good to know that you find this time with CTED to be useful for your career development. It's really exciting that we have celebrating 10 years. I remember how it all started. And it started actually with a sabbatical that I took 10 years ago at NYU. It actually was divided after a few years at the UN. I wanted some time to reflect, think, ended up with a book that nobody read. But I spent half of my time with NYU in the old building and half of my time at Columbia at the law school. And it was probably the best time of my life because I really enjoyed the hospitality, the warmth, the intellectual environment that I was surrounded by colleagues and professors, such as the ones that we have at NYU. But using that time allowed me and my colleagues to reflect a little bit on what we can get from cooperation with academia. It was years before we founded the GRN. One thing that we, as professionals supporting the UN Security Council, learned over the years is the enormous gap between policy making and data and evidence. It was sometimes shocking to us seeing member states speak with confidence on how to solve world problems without relying on research and data. Moving from statements and policy to very often advocacy, not to mention propaganda. And for those of us who care deeply about counterterrorism, and I would say gladly that all CTED colleagues care deeply about counterterrorism, we felt that there is enormous gap here. And we start seeing our job is as bringing closer evidence, data, research to policy making. And it was the big mission that started with NYU. You mentioned many of the projects we worked with you, but the first project was actually on a topic called API, Advanced Passenger Information. And now it's kind of the bread and butter of aviation security, but back then it was not. And we started looking with the support of NYU students on what API actually means and how to integrate it in national systems. And that was the first project. And I've done it with a colleague, I don't know if you remember Christian Marr, maybe some of the veterans remember him. We worked together with NYU and we identified that this is something that is important, feasible, and supported by data that it actually prevents travel. 10 years later, and that API is bread and butter and part of UN Security Council resolution 2178, I think one of you mentioned that. It was also developed further into requirements to have PNR, another acronym, and now many, many member states are using it, developing this system, and see it as part of their counterterrorism work. Many of the projects you mentioned somehow found themselves into Security Council agenda, into the CTC guidance. Certainly the work done on drones is already reflected, and I think many of those colleagues who attended, you attended virtually the meeting in Delhi, right? Mm-hmm. We attended, we were there, but that analysis that you provided us was extremely, extremely valuable. So that was big, big effort, and it was well before we even thought about institutionalizing this cooperation with academia. A few years later, after developing relations with more academic institutions, we found that we need to start turning into something which is institutional, something that really is part of the way CTED does its business. We launched the network in 2015. We took the advice of NYU on how to develop the network, and I think you mentioned 2 projects that you've done on how to make best use of this network. And sure enough, even the network itself is recognized in the UN Security Council resolutions, welcome, and today it's referenced across the board in all our activities. Use the GRN, because for us as professionals, as I said, it's natural that you have to connect data and research to policy. But the best feedback we got on the utility was from the member states themselves, who see enormous value from this connection with academia and want more and more of this as part of their own development of policy. And they may have very different views about the right way to develop this policy, but all of them agree that research is the basis. Sometimes they criticize us, a fair criticism, that we rely more on institutions from a certain region or regions. And that's part of the challenge we're dealing with the GRN, how to expand it, how to make it truly global. It's true that many of the research institutions in the West are much more resourced and have more capabilities to be present in our meetings, to produce research in English that everyone can read. But there is enormous research, valuable research that comes from other parts of the world. And we're making every effort to expand the network. Just a year ago, we established very good relations with an institute in Saudi Arabia, and we will have a meeting. And actually, in the last meeting that you held, we had two representatives from a university in Saudi Arabia, if you recall, who really wanted to learn how the cooperation with NYU works and how they could export that cooperation into Saudi Arabia. And I think we're doing some great things with them. So this is clearly an enormous value of the cooperation that we have. And again, NYU was the first one. Another benefit that we have from this cooperation is what I would call sandbox exercise. One of the challenges that we have in CTED, it's a wonderful opportunity for us, an amazing opportunity for you to be part of, is the proximity to the UN Security Council. We develop things and then they come to the most important global forum, international forum. But that is also some risks, because when you're very close to the kitchen, bringing new ideas which are not cooked enough is a danger for CTED. It may jeopardize our integrity, our bias. It may get us into problems. Some member states may like, some member states may don't like certain issues. And the idea that we have a sandbox, which is unique to the cooperation that we have with NYU, where we can play with ideas without necessarily taking full ownership of them, is something that we are very grateful for. Because eventually, whenever we need that, and rarely do we need that, we say, sorry, it's an academic research of NYU. It's an independent research institution, well recognized, globally recognized, and this is their research. We take good advantage of that sandbox that the cooperation with NYU allows us to serve as an incubator of ideas, where we at the end can say, we take this, but we're not going to take that. And that is an extremely valuable contribution. In fact, the project that you presented is a perfect example of a sandbox idea. Repatriation is an extremely sensitive issue for member states. You mentioned that in some countries in Europe just oppose any engagement or international engagement on the topic. You move further east to Central Asia, there is a whole embracement and huge pride of the efforts they make on and the achievements they make on repatriation. Some countries rehabilitate, some countries send to jail, and how all of this can be reflected into policy making, it's a very big and extremely sensitive question. So the fact that we could outsource it without taking full ownership until and unless we're ready is a huge contribution that we benefit tremendously from. So from CTED side, and that I'll wrap up my points, we are extremely grateful and thankful to all of you